Hello and welcome. We are a body like Bruce. It's been a long time, but we have recently come across this article in a very old magazine titled The Life and Death of Bruce Lee, His Final Victim by Albert Goldman, Part 2. We'll strive to find Part 1. Might take a while, but we'll find it. For the first time, the truth about what killed the legendary Kung Fu star and the cover-up that followed. And this painting was done by Don Punchatz. All the witnesses agree during the last months of his life, Bruce Lee was heading Take 2. Hello, we are a body like Bruce. It's been a while now. Recently we came across this article in a very old magazine titled The Life and Death of Bruce Lee, His Final Victim by Albert Goldman, and this is Part 2. We will strive to find Part 1. We will find it, but it might take quite a while to actually locate it. For the first time, the truth about what killed the legendary Kung Fu star and the cover-up that followed. And this particular painting is by Don Punchatz. All the witnesses agree. During the last months of his life, Bruce Lee was heading for a crack-up. No matter how you sized him up, the danger signals were unmistakable. The most obvious signal was weight loss. During his best years, Lee, who stood between 5'6" and 5'7" and was very lightly boned, built himself up through diet and exercise to a peak of 155 pounds. Now this extra poundage began to melt away. Eventually he went down to 120. When Danny Inosanto, Lee's principal disciple, saw his master for the last time, he was shocked by the change in his appearance. "You're too thin," he warned. "How are you going to get your full power?" "My full power," hissed Lee. "How about this?" With that he gave Inosanto a shoulder shot that sent the disciple flying 12 feet across the room. All the same, Lee was concerned about his inexplicable weight loss. His solution was to adopt a particularly nauseating diet: congealed bull's blood and mixed with raw hamburger steak. A more serious sign that Bruce Lee was in trouble was the startling fact that he had abandoned his exercise routine. A fanatic about physical conditioning and training, Lee had spent the better part of his life running, doing calisthenics, lifting weights, practicing martial arts exercises and sparring with his students. Believing that running was the best exercise, he did 2 to 6 miles of road work every day and pedalled 10 to 20 miles every other day on a stationary bicycle. To achieve the ultimate in muscular strength and coordination, he had filled almost every room of his house in Hong Kong with martial arts gear and exercise machines, most of the latter designed to his own specifications. Now, though, he spent most of his time locked up in his second floor study, talking frantically on his telephones, sketching scenarios and holding business conferences. Money occupied the centre of Lee's mind in his last days. After a lifetime of barely breaking even, he was determined, now that he was famous enough, to make and keep a fortune. His ideas of finance were pretty crude. Basically, he was concerned with hiding his wealth. He put his $250,000 house in the name of his butler, Wen Yang, so that in the event of a divorce, his wife couldn't claim a share in the property. A more important consideration was how to hide his money from the IRS, for Lee was intent upon returning to Hollywood now that he was a superstar, but he dreaded the thought that the American government would take an enormous bite out of his earnings. When he sought the advice of Werner Wolfen, one of the smartest taxmen in Los Angeles, he was told firmly by this expert, who saw Lee as a street person, that he would not participate in any illegal schemes. Lee left the lawyer office in high dudgeon. Just before he died, however, Lee sent the tax expert a handwritten note agreeing to follow his advice. This pattern of defying reason and then reversing himself was highly characteristic of Lee. It was the yin and yang of his reckless and impulsive temperament. Another reason that Bruce Lee spent so much time holed up inside his walled villa, not a mansion by any means, but a narrow two-story Japanese-style house with its back to a railroad track, was that he was suffering from paranoia. During his final months, Lee fancied himself like a character in one of his films, surrounded on every side by enemies. Just as striking as the similarity between life and art, however, was the difference. In his films, Bruce Lee walks fearlessly into death traps, cloaked in the invulnerable provided by his magic arts. In real life, he craved weapons, especially weapons he could wear on his person without being detected. So he caused to be smuggled into Hong Kong, which has very strict laws against any sort of weapon, a whole arsenal of concealed weapons. Apparently he did it through Bob Baker. Among his deadly tools were a comb that spat out a blade like an ice pick, a tear gas pen, a sword cane with a 12-inch blade, a walking stick with a .410 shotgun shell at one end and a tear gas canister at the other, a pearl-handed 22 caliber magnum loaded double-barreled Derringer smuggled inside a 10-gallon can of Jack LaLanne protein powder, or Jack LaLanne, and a slew of shurikens. What was that? Shurikens. The six-sided throwing stars that can be hurled with far greater accuracy than any knife or else held between the knuckles like a razor for slashing. Lee was not content simply to carry these weapons for self-defense. On more than one occasion he whipped them out and brandished them with terrifying effect. Typical is the story that Wong Nuk Chung, personal manager of Golden Harvest Films and the editor-writer of a Bruce Lee fan magazine, after the release of Return of the Dragon, the only completed film that Lee wrote, or Where the Dragon, and stunt coordinated, Mr. Wong wrote a little note in his fan magazine saying that Bruce Lee had not matured yet as a director. That was an understatement, to put it mildly. This film is far and away the worst of the Bruce Lee pictures, and the fault is entirely that of its author, director, and stunt coordinator. What Wong didn't understand when he voiced his timid little criticism was that Bruce Lee, who had always been so open, friendly, and down-to-earth in his relations with the editor of the fan magazine, was now a changed man. No sooner did Lee read the notice than he summoned Wong to the office of the boss of the film company, Raymond Chow. The moment Wong walked through the door, he got an order from Lee to sit down. Then the famous star fixed the frail little editor with his most deadly basilisk stare and clenched his teeth in precisely the manner he used in all his films to warn the villain that his time was near. Lee proceeded to teach the writer his lesson. When you take a pen, he enunciated with pedantic but terrifying precision, it's exactly as if you took a knife or a gun, one slip and you've inflicted a deadly wound. Then, just to make the point a little clearer, Lee grabbed his belt buckle and extracted from it one of those concealed knives you see advertised in mercenary magazines like Soldier of Fortune, laying the tip of his blade precisely on the carotid artery in the editor's neck. Lee drove home his point. My knife is just like your pen. If you criticise, you hurt. Wong, frozen with fear, gasped out the excuse that he had meant no harm, that his criticism was intended to act as an incentive for Lee to improve. Raymond Chow, another frail, bespectacled, professorial-looking man, chimed in with his assurances that Wong had meant well. Finally, the enraged Bruce Lee could no longer contain his rage. Turning to the office door, he gave it one of his famous kicks and sent it flying down the hall. Only then did he begin to simmer down and come to his senses. Characteristically, he wound up shaking hands and apologising for his choleric behaviour. Editor Wong was by no means the principal offender in the local press. More frequent targets of Lee's rage were the newspapers, men, and especially the photographers. Though the local press worshipped Bruce Lee, it was naturally obsessed with the sex life of the man who restored masculinity to the Chinese screen. To quote Golden Harvest's first Bruce Lee publicity release. Lee, for his part, was enjoying sexual abundance for the first time in his life. Brought up in an uptight environment that hadn't allowed him sexual fulfillment as a youth, involved from the age of 24 in a tight marriage, an obscure little Chinaman in Hollywood that's always infatuated with the current style of Occidental beauty, Bruce Lee was just now, at the age of 32, having his first taste of being irresistible to women, an experience that would turn most men's heads. Unfortunately, he was not discreet in managing his license, nor is Hong Kong congested, gossip-ridden, a Chinese village of 5 million souls, the kind of place where concealment is easy. The upshot was that every time Lee indulged himself in a passing affair with one of his co-stars, or a model or a courtesan, a story accompanied by a picture of the pair would turn up in the press. Instead of resigning himself to this provocation, Lee would invariably fly into a rage and go roaring down to the office of the paper with murder in his heart. Charging into the copy room, he would demand to know who had written the story or taken the photograph. If he found his prey, he would slap the man round or choke him by the throat and then smash his camera. When the poor wretch was scared out of his wits, Lee would make a final speech, warning in tones that could not be forgotten that the next time this happened, he would come back and massacre the entire staff. In a town with 2 or 3 papers, these tactics of intimidation might have worked in Hong Kong, which at that time had 121 dailies. There was always a fresh team of newsmen ready to risk their necks to get a hot scoop on the dragon. The most serious aspect of Bruce Lee's bizarre behaviour was the threat it posed to his most vital relationships, especially his professional relationships. Everybody who worked with the explosive star recognised that dealing with Lee was like handling dynamite. Every effort was made to avoid tension or quarrels. Lee's wishes were deterred to in everything. Lee was allowed to call all the shots. Even so, there was no way to avoid accidents in the tricky business of making movies, especially movies that focused on violent physical combat. One of the most revealing episodes from Lee's final phase is the story of his deadly confrontation with Bob Wall during the making of Enter the Dragon. In one scene, Wall, playing a villain, attacks Lee with 2 jagged-edged broken bottles. Lee knocks the bottles out of Wall's hands with a spinning kick, then he raises his hands to counter the next attack. The first time the scene was tried, Lee missed his kick, and when he spun around with his raised fist, he scored his hand against the jagged glass. The injury was not serious. At most it would sideline Lee for 2 weeks. When Wall exclaimed, "Gee, I'm sorry, Bruce," Lee snapped, "A curl. No problem," and left for Dr. Langford, his personal physician. The truth was, however, that this accident injury posed a grave problem because it caused Bruce Lee to lose face in front of the crew and the extras. Bruce Lee, after all, was regarded by the Chinese as a Superman, a fighter who dealt out deadly punishment but who really took a blow, much less one that drew blood and put him out of action. Soon Bob Wall began to hear stories that Bruce Lee was going to murder the man who had maimed him. Wall, who had known Lee for years and recognised his sensitivity, put his head together with Fred Weintraub, the picture producer, and came up with a solution. One afternoon, Wall drove out to Bruce Lee's house and confronted him with the rumours that were going about. Lee denied everything, putting all the blame on the Chinese. Wall persisted, explaining that he realised how important it was for Lee to maintain his image. Then he outlined his plan for getting the star off the hook. Lee fell in with the suggestion at once. The first day that shooting resumed, Bruce Lee stood up in front of the assembled crew and made a short speech in Chinese. He explained that he had intended to kill Bob Wall as a matter of honour, but because Wall was an old friend and was needed to complete the picture, Lee had decided to assuage his pride by administering a terrible beating to the White Devil. Wall at this point opened his gi to show that he was not wearing any protective padding. Then, with the cameras rolling, the men squared off to fight. Wall had told Lee that no matter how hard he kicked, Wall could take the blow. Now Lee went to work with vengeance. His first kick landed with such force that it hurled Wall into an extra standing behind him, breaking the man's arm. 8 times Bruce Lee kicked Bob Wall, who never failed to utter loud groans and gasps until Lee's footprints were all over Wall's chest and abdomen. Finally, the scene was wrapped. That night, Lee took Wall to supper at Hugo's, Hong Kong's finest French restaurant. As they sat at the table, Lee exclaimed, "Bob, that was the greatest thing anybody ever did for me. Did I hurt you?" Ward replied that he had been hurt worse in other fights. Though all the American karate men who worked with Bruce Lee respected him for his great abilities and remembered him fondly for the way he had been in the good old days, they grew steadily more disenchanted with his behaviour in Hong Kong. Particularly those who were seeking to make a career in films resented the way they were set up in the Bruce Lee films to look like clumsy oafs who could be knocked around at will by a guy who was much smaller than they. They recognised that when the films were exhibited, the fans would not view them as dramas in which the American karate men were playing assigned parts. The public would assume that the Americans were in fact inferior fighters, big klutzy dudes who just couldn't hold their own against the dragon. This struck a sore spot among the Americans because they knew that though Bruce Lee had worked out with them many times, he had never once engaged in actual competition. His excuse was that tournament fighting was unreal, like swimming on dry land. But when Joe Louis and subsequently Bill Wallace introduced full contact karate, this excuse would no longer hold water. Light contact karate was introduced in 1963. You were not supposed to strike the face, and blows to the body were supposed to be half pulled. Full contact karate was introduced by Joe Louis at Long Beach on January 17, 1970. The feeling among the American karate men was that Bruce Lee simply didn't want to take the chances every competition fighter took of being hurt or defeated. His image, in other words, was more important to him than the actual test of combat. The upshot of this feeling was a gradual estrangement between Bruce Lee and his old friends in the karate world. Some of the men who appeared in films with him swore that they would never repeat the experience. Others developed a rather wry and ironic attitude toward Lee, making fun of his histrionics on the screen, his poses, grimaces and noises, none of which has any real connection with the martial arts. They especially ridiculed the notion that Lee could defeat champions who were much taller and heavier than he, or that he could take on a fighter like Muhammad Ali. Each man using his own style and walk of the winner, an idea that cherished by many Bruce Lee fans. In short, the karate man protested against the illusion that was the greatest product of Bruce Lee's art, the universal conviction that he was the deadliest man on the planet. In the final period of his life, Bruce Lee began to rely on hashish to lift him from his oppressed mind all the terrible burns that were driving him mad. He had a young gopher who was charged with the dangerous assignment of procuring the drug, which was smuggled in from Nepal, probably by Bob Wall. We read that it was Bob Wall. Not Bob Wall. Bob Baker. One assignment of procuring the drug, which was smuggled in from Nepal. Like many other Oriental countries, Hong Kong has highly punitive laws against literal or illegal drugs. Possession of even 5 grams of cannabis resin is punishable by a fine of 5 million Hong Kong dollars and life imprisonment. Bruce Lee, and a moderate man by nature, was not the kind to limit himself to just a couple of puffs on a hash pipe. In fact, he never smoked hash because, being a non-smoker, he had an aversion to inhaling. It was his custom to eat the drug in the form of confections. Bob Wall recalls a visit to Bruce Lee's house about 6 months before Lee's death. And we shall continue that in part 2 of this. Part 2 of this Bruce Lee article. If you like this, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, add your comments below in the comment section, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can on those. And then go share this video with all your family, friends, and others who are ardent Bruce Lee fans.